Aloha mai kako, and welcome to this presentation on the draft long-term recovery plan. My name is Jen Maiden. I'm with the Office of Recovery, and with me is also
Kate Blystone. I'm with Department of Planning.
Mahalo for joining us. The presentation will provide you an overview of the draft long-term recovery plan, covering what it is, what it isn't, and its relationship to other plans and recovery efforts that are ongoing. To start us out, we'll just talk about what is recovery. This graphic highlights the overlap between preparedness, response, and recovery that a community faces after a significant disaster. Recovery is a sequence of independent and other concurrent activities that allow a community to progressively advance towards its planned recovery outcomes. From pre-incident through long-term, recovery activities are interconnected and cannot be separated in sequential efforts. Grounding us in the 7 recovery principles established within the Maui County Recovery Framework. These were the foundations of recovery work and the long-term recovery planning process. First, community-led, government-supported. Focus on individuals and families. Leadership and local primacy. Engaged partnerships and inclusiveness. Unity of effort. Focus on safety, resilience, and sustainability. And psychological and emotional recovery. So what is the long-term recovery plan? It's a community-driven process supported by government, providing a roadmap to recovery via projects and programs covering many issues. And it lines us up for potential access to funding to implement the projects and programs. The purpose and scope of the long-term recovery plan is to identify priority projects to ensure a coordinated, holistic, and community-informed approach to reaching Lahaina's recovery goals. The plan serves as a guide for the community and government to work towards recovery. It is a snapshot in time of recovery needs and priority projects. It is intended to be a living document that will evolve as the recovery of Lahaina progresses. The scope of the plan includes county, state, and community-identified recovery projects and programs that will guide the planning, program development, future land use decisions, potential changes in zoning and development regulations, and funding prioritization for Lahaina's recovery. As important of understanding the purpose of the long-term recovery plan is to understand its relationship to other plans. There are plans that existed for West Maui prior to the fire, such as the West Maui Community Wildfire Protection Plan, the West Maui Community Corridor Framework, and the West Maui Community Plan. These plans provided key input and priorities for development of the long-term recovery plan. There are also countywide plans that were informative to the development of the long-range recovery plan. Countywide Policy Plan, Maui Island Plan, and the Hazard Mitigation Plan. And then there's also state plans that are informative, the State Strategic Plan and State Hazard Mitigation Plan. And then there are other recovery plans that are in response to the fire. The Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Action Plan is a process ongoing parallel to the long-term recovery plan, but separate from the recovery plan. It has a narrower focus and will be finalized after the long-term recovery plan. And then there's also specific recovery project plans that will come out of the long-term plan. And there are also other recovery efforts, like the long-term recovery group, that are focusing on supporting individuals and families with their recovery needs. The long-term recovery plan will be tracked, its progress will be tracked by the Office of Recovery in coordination with project leads. The Office of Recovery will provide updates on the progress of projects via the Maui Recovers Ola Lahaina website and other mechanisms. The plan will be updated as projects are completed, reflecting changing needs, conditions, available funding, and community feedback. It'll be updated at logical intervals to reflect implementation progress and project modifications.
So let's talk a little bit about our recovery planning process. At the beginning of this process, we did a community needs assessment. And like Jen said, we reviewed our existing plans. With that knowledge, we engaged with the community and asked what projects and programs and what things needed to happen in the rebuild. All of that led to RSF's project development, and an RSF is a recovery support function. From here on, I'll call them teams. So these teams around all the different aspects of recovery prepared projects. At the same time, the state was preparing a list of projects that they knew they needed to put into the plan. And the result was the long-term recovery plan that we'll be talking about next. Let's talk about community engagement, though, because that was a critical piece of this process. It's a first step in the long-term recovery planning process because, as Jen said, it's community-led and government-supported. So if we did our job right, the community should see its voices in the projects and programs that are in the long-term recovery plan. If you're interested in learning more about the community engagement that we did, you can take a look at our summary report that was completed in August of 2024 at this QR code right here. But at a glance, we engaged 3,833 people across 11 activities. We did 5 neighborhood workshops across Lahaina, and those workshops resulted in 900 participants. We had 3 surveys and 2,700 respondents to those surveys. And surveys were critical because that brought our neighbors and friends who had moved away back into the process from wherever they are. And because one-on-one conversations are sometimes easier for people, we did 190 interviews to collect public comment on this process. Here's what we learned at the very highest level. If you want more detail, do take a look at the plan that I just mentioned, the report that I mentioned a couple slides ago. But at the very highest level, we learned that the community wants a safe community when it's rebuilt, with resilient infrastructure and communication systems, prevention for wildfire to prevent this from happening again, connected streets and efficient evacuation routes, and safe streets for pedestrians. They also wanted shoreline hazard education to understand the dangers of rebuilding in the shoreline. We also heard loud and clear that culture and history is central to Lahaina, and honoring that history and cultural significance is going to be critical during the rebuild. So we need places where people can understand that history and gather in a multicultural fashion. Housing is clearly an issue for the people of Lahaina, and attainable, affordable housing came up again and again. We need to support our residents who want to return and rebuild and provide accessible housing for our kupuna. We also want assistance with the permitting and rebuilding process and limiting short-term rentals. And Malama Aina and Vai was critical, that restoring these ecosystem functions that we've lost over time, Maukata Makai, with indigenous plants, maintaining non-native grasses, managing those grasses, and restoring our agriculture was critical to the community. But one thing stood out more than anything else, and that when Lahaina is rebuilt, it should feel like home. It should feel like a place for the residents that live there, and welcome visitors second without displacing those locals and impacting their quality of life. We need to have the services and businesses that support residents' needs and maintain that small town character. So as I mentioned before, these recovery support functions or teams work together to create the projects and programs that are in the long-term recovery plan that we're going to talk about in just a second. Those teams were community planning, economic recovery, health and social services, housing, infrastructure, natural and cultural resources. And as I mentioned, we worked closely with the state. So the county, the state, our federal partners, and community stakeholders worked very closely together throughout this process to find where the projects that we were considering matched up and where they didn't, and then made adjustments to create the plan that you're going to see soon. So as I said, all these county and state teams got together with their long-term recovery projects and programs and began prioritizing them. They also identified whether a project was short-term, mid-term, or long-term. And then together, we reviewed all the projects and determined whether they were required, meaning that they were necessary for the rebuild of Lahaina, whether they were right, meaning that the community said they were right, or the departments and recovery teams that were working on this said they were right for the recovery, and whether they were ready. And so if they were ready, that meant they were good to go, they had all the funding they needed, and it was something that just could start, or they have a longer lead time. So that means we have to start now in order to get to where we need to go. In the end, we had approximately 30 projects out of the total 50 projects that we discussed that we identified as being featured in the long-term recovery plan. Those other projects were then, the ones that are not in that approximately 30 projects, were then put into the appendix. And I will say at this time that we ultimately ended up with 40 overall projects because we learned through the process that we could combine a few to create those where they were connected with each other. So ultimately we have approximately 40 projects in the plan, with 30 of those projects being featured.
Now I'll walk you through an overview of the projects included in the long-term recovery plan. And as Kate mentioned, there are a handful of projects that are featured in the long-term recovery plan, and they're organized by short, mid, and long-term, and that's the time frame of their expected project completion. And then there's projects in the appendix as well, for a total of about 40 projects, and covering all recovery support functions teams: community planning, economic recovery, health and social services, housing, infrastructure, and natural cultural resources. And many of the projects, there's varying responsibility. There's county, state, nonprofit, community, private responsibility for implementation of these projects. Some projects have many components and phases, and many will require in-depth planning, design, and community engagement going forward. The sum of these projects in the plan provides a holistic, high-level picture of the recovery challenges, needs, and actions going forward. And keep in mind that the recovery needs of individuals and families are being supported in other ways as well, such as the long-term recovery group. So first, moving on to the projects that are identified as short-term project completion. And this means that the project will take about 1 to 2 years for project completion. And thinking of the project initiation time, the start time, as the projects, some are started now, and some will be more towards the beginning of 2025. So for the short-term projects, 1 to 2 years for project completion, first is the Rebuild Lahaina Plan. This is a blueprint for rebuilding of Lahaina town. This will be a project to be important to start right away. In fact, we have already started scoping this project, and a lot of its focus will be on uses within the commercial area, public spaces, mobility, and transportation within Lahaina, and a focus on Front Street. The National Historic Landmark District update. This involves coordination with the National Park District to look at the integrity of the historic district, look at the boundaries and potential adjustments, and including other periods of historical significance. Affordable rental housing programs. This supports the reconstruction of the 10 affordable apartment developments that were lost in the fire. Healthcare service expansion. This includes a gap analysis of health, behavioral health, and social services exacerbated by the fire, and identifying solutions to increase access. Infrastructure assessment and improvement studies analyzes current infrastructure and needed improvements to meet recovery needs and match the Rebuild Lahaina Plan town. Enhance emergency communication networks to ensure that communication networks are redundant and reliable during emergencies. Emergency resiliency and redundancy, studies and assessments of energy efficiency and important opportunities for resiliency, such as the power lines, and creation of a Lahaina memorial. This would be a very strong community-led project to honor those lost and survivors in the fire. Moving on to the midterm projects that are 3 to 5 years for project completion. First being the Maui Emergency Management Agency Advancement Program that has 4 elements, including emergency services infrastructure, staffing, shelters, and community education and engagement. a Maui County real estate program to identify and manage acquisition of property within the impact zone for many purposes. Lahaina Business Center is a temp site to support local businesses and jumpstart the economy. Rebuild the West Maui Senior Center, potentially in a new location and with a larger footprint and expanded services. Street connectivity and extensions for fire evacuation connectivity throughout Lahaina Town. Puhua Street extension, including connecting the roadway and upgrading utilities. Lahaina water infrastructure firefighting capacity, addressing deficiencies and low fire flow. Stormwater resiliency and flood risk management. This includes the Lahaina Town Drainage Master Plan update and preliminary design for the flood control project, MALCA, of the town. VI and watershed recovery planning. This includes creating a watershed recovery working group. Fire risk reduction and mitigation, reducing fire risk around the town and implementing actions from the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Agriculture planning and long-term food security, including developing a Lahaina Ag Plan. Oh, and I believe I missed one, community facilities. That is rebuilding the state library and the Kamehameha III elementary school, identifying new locations and rebuilding those important community facilities. Moving on to the last group, the long-term projects for project completion 6 and more years. And even though these projects are estimated to be completed in 6 or more years, many of them have started because they have long lead times and they are complicated. So starting with the Lahaina Bypass Phase 1C, a state project, and the West Maui Greenway from the Civic Center to Launeopoco Beach Park. It's a multi-use path that has other community purposes such as emergency evacuation and access, and fuel break and utility corridor. Keoloho, space for health services, education, and human services to support fire survivors. West Maui Hospital and Foundation. This is a private project, 25-bed critical access hospital. R1 recycled water expansion, planning, design, construction to improve and expand recycled water distribution and infrastructure in West Maui. Water source development, increase access to existing groundwater sources, revegetating and reforesting Lahaina and Kula. Green workforce development, creation of green jobs and opportunities to diversify the economy and provide environmental restoration. Creation of a cultural corridor, including the restoration of Malu'ulu Olele, Moku'ula, and Loko o Mokuhunia complex. And preservation, restoration, and revitalization of structures lost, historic structures lost in the fire, documenting of people's stories, and creation of cultural spaces in a historic corridor. And within the appendix, these are the projects, again, in short, mid, and long term. And some projects have been combined to get us to this 40 number of projects and programs within the long-term recovery plan. So work was really not lost, but connections were made where projects had a nexus with one another. Now to provide an overview of what the projects and programs look like within the draft long-term recovery plan. Each project has 2 sheets covering various details of the project. First, there's a tile up top that shows you the estimated project completion time, the short, mid, long term. The project complexity, is it low, medium, high complexity? The phase that the project is within, planning, design, or construction. And the estimated costs of the project, low, medium, high. And public participation. In the plan, you'll see that this public participation tile is identified as to be determined and not identified specifically at this point in time. We will go through a process of working with the various project leads to identify the appropriate public participation necessary going forward. The project sheets also cover a project description, purpose, identifying any interdependencies and roadblocks, and the necessary next steps of the project, along with project details, including a cost estimate. Some have firm cost estimates, some do not, and they're identified as to be determined. Potential funding sources, the project lead, and project partners. And all of these details are the best information at this point in time and will be adapted and refined as projects get underway. How can you be involved in reviewing and commenting on the draft long-term recovery plan? The draft plan will be available on Maui Recover's Ola Lahaina next week, the week of October 21st. We will hold 2 in-person open houses, both at Lahaina Luna High School Dining Hall. The first one will be on Wednesday, October 23rd from 4 to 7 p.m. And the second will be on Saturday, October 26th, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Stop by anytime. There will be no formal presentation, but stop by and view boards of the projects, talk to project leads to learn more, and share your feedback. We will also have an online open house that provides you the opportunity to review the projects and provide your feedback from the comfort of your own home on your own time. And all of the feedback will be incorporated into the long-term recovery plan, and the final will be available by the end of the year. Mahalo for joining us for this overview of the draft long-term recovery plan. We appreciate your attention and all of the input that the community has put into developing this plan. Mahalo nui loa.